Welcome to Food Criminals, Last Seating by Chris Garcia. Part 1. Historical Restaurant Murders. Inn Murders of the 19th century and before. Once a traveler leaves his home, he loses almost 100% of his ability to control his environment. Special Agent Dale Cooper. Restaurant murders are nothing new. As long as there have been road trips, there have been inns. The European style inn really started as a precursor of today's Airbnb. People would rent out an extra bed or even a space in the stables, and feed any traveler who might need bunk and chow for a night. These were unofficial, but really, they would evolve in today's highway motels, hotels, and rest stops. They were important in enabling travelers not only to have a place to stay, but as a way to avoid spending a night out along a trail where they might have to deal with highwaymen, local tribes, or wild animals. Now, with a clientele that is on the go as a rule, and with no way to communicate with folks back home, it was not too unusual for an inn to be the final stop for travelers who checked in, had a meal, but never checked out. Thefts happened often, even at some reputable inns, but murders were not unheard of. There are several examples, of varying veracity, that show how dangerous old-timey inn life could be. The Ostrich Inn, Colnbrook, England. The Ostrich Inn may or may not be nearly a millennium old. It might also only be 500 years old. With a building that old, 500 years may not make much of a difference. Instead of raising and starting over with older buildings, many new buyers would simply add on or remodel. Fix and flip was a thing even in the dim, dark past. It's certainly possible that there are elements of the Ostrich building that date back to the 12th century. The story goes it was originally called the Hospice, while under that name it was visited by a couple of historic important people. Of course, this could actually be a conflation with a former building, possibly the hospital or hospice of the local abbey that may have stood on the exact same site. There are a myriad of other possibilities, but those two are the most likely. All we know for sure is that the place still stands, not too far from Heathrow Airport, and has a delightful menu today. In 1215, King John, a.k.a. Softsword, a.k.a. Lackland, a.k.a. the Lion in Disney's Robin Hood, was on his way to Runnymede to sign a treaty with a bunch of rebellious barons who were threatening war. The Archbishop of Canterbury drafted the original version of the Carta Libertatum, which was signed and settled some hash for a little bit between the warring sides. Of course, no one really took it to heart at first. There was a war with the crown and the barons. Then King John died. His son used the Carta Libertatum as a basis for more laws, at which time they renamed the original document the Magna Carta. On the way, supposedly, King John stopped with his retinue and stayed at the hospice. Whether this is true or not, or simply became a story to draw tourists at some point in the past, is uncertain. It could be that his team stayed at the hospice, or at the actual hospice that might have stood on the spot. There's no way to be certain. The building was certainly there in the early 17th century, when Dick Turpin, arguably the most famous of highwaymen, stayed at the inn. The Ostrich is, and was, not the only inn to make that claim that Turpin and his gang stayed there. Looking at the areas where his alleged crimes took place, it's certainly possible he could have. The possibly real criminal matter of the Ostrich comes into play in the 12th century, or maybe the 17th. Again, at this distance, it's a difference that really doesn't matter. The story goes that the inn was owned by the Jarmans, a couple who recognized that, 1, since they were on the road out of London, visitors might well be carrying goods and cash, and 2, that they were especially vulnerable. Supposedly, Mr. Jarman installed a bed placed on top of a trap door. At night, when the Mark was asleep, Mr. Jarman would pull the lever and the person in the bed would fall down a chute to the basement, where a giant pot of boiling water would be waiting, stewing the unfortunate victim alive, allowing the Jarmans to grab whatever was left behind in the room. Of course, there's a lot in that story that makes it less than credible. The first is that they claimed 60 people were victims, but even when folks back then would start looking for missing loved ones. Also, if you're dunked into a pot of boiling water, it takes a while to die, and it would be insanely hard to actually keep people down there long enough to kill them. The amount of flame that would be needed to keep a human-sized boiler going would have caused any room above it to be stifling hot. The other thing that makes this unlikely is that there is no record of it until the 17th century, and a book called Jack of Newbury, a novel by Thomas Deloney. It is likely that the novel and notoriety it gained, being attracted to such a well-known inn, led to the story being tied to the invention of Sweeney Todd. The Bleeding Horse. Ireland's long tradition of roadside inns has left more than food and lodging in memory. In Dublin, few taverns carried a reputation as grim as the Bleeding Horse, a public house dating back to the 17th century. Its name itself comes from a legend. An injured horse apparently stumbled in from a nearby skirmish, leaving the floor stained. When your business is named after a wounded animal, you've pretty much assured that it's going to be a place for rough trade of varying kinds. Now, while the Bleeding Horse's origins are fairly metal, the stories of the dangers that one could get themselves into at the inn are far harder to track down. By the 19th century, it had gained a reputation as a rough-and-tumble place. Camden Street was a crossroads for all types, travelers and locals alike. This has been a recipe for crime, as locals would sometimes try and take advantage of travelers, and travelers could simply move on to the next inn if they committed crimes against locals. There were rumors that travelers would disappear from the inn as early as the late 18th century. That's a possibility, but also might just have been the fact that often pub owners like to advertise their pubs as rougher than they actually were. A town like Dublin, full of folks from all social strata, is exactly the kind of place where locals would drink wherever was close by, but the moneyed class would travel if there was a good time to be had, and what rich person doesn't like slumming? Add to that the rumors of ghosts, and you've managed to make the Bleeding Horse into a very attractive destination. James Joyce even wrote of the Bleeding Horse in Ulysses, where Leopold Bloom visits the pub. The Bleeding Horse is one of those inns where there's no good evidence, but the reputation will live with it. And the more fame it gains, the stronger the belief that once it was a bully establishment. The Relay Inn. Now we are in Pennsylvania, and it's the 19th century. The Relay Inn was built in 1799, and it's a pretty standard stagecoach stop. Now, Mifflin County wasn't the roughest of areas. There are significant Amish communities in the county. The Amish established themselves there in 1791, and more than 30 established groups existed, and to this day exist within the county. Now, it's not so much a crime that takes place in the Relay Inn that makes it an important part of the myth and mystery. It is the evidence of a crime. In this case, a potential blood stain. At some point in the 19th century, there appeared a stain on the floor. This stain is not huge, but it was evident and looked like a blood stain. There were supposedly attempts to clean it up, and they all ended just making the stain more pronounced. The stain was on the floorboards in one of the bedrooms, and while many, including owners in the mid-20th century, said it was just darker portions of the wood, the stain was on the floorboards of one of the bedrooms, and many, including owners in the mid-20th century, said it was just darker portions of the wood. Perhaps trying to tap into the potential of drawing visitors, the myth arose that a murder had taken place in the inn. There's no records of anything in any of the contemporary papers. There have been reports of ghosts, of course, including in that very bedroom. Perhaps the stain is the ghost trying to draw attention, but more likely, it's the owners trying to draw a few more customers. The building still stands today, but it's a private residence. Thank you for listening to Food Criminals, Last Seating. I'm Chris Garcia. Next week, The Bloody Benders.